My name's Keith Edwards. I'm a speaker, consultant, and coach, and you can find out more about me at keithedwards.com. I've just released a new book, Unmasking Toward Authentic Masculinity. You can find it wherever you get your books. I'm thrilled to introduce today's panel, which is part of the Father's Friday Summer Series. As a father of two daughters, I am grateful for Fathering Together for bringing together such a collection of thoughtful leaders, disruptors, and organizations working to change our perspective on how dads engage with their families, communities, and workplaces. Today's topic focuses on dad's role in ending gender-based violence. You're going to hear from four folks I know and respect for their scholarship, activism, organizing, thoughtfulness, and generosity. As a practitioner in this space, I can't underscore the importance of the following conversation enough. I've been speaking about gender-based violence for more than 20 years. We often tell men that they should care about gender-based violence because it could happen to the women they love and care about. If this helps you connect for the first time, then that's great. But this approach reinforces a gender binary, minimizes the violence men experience, often from other men, and can foster paternalistic ways of men engaging in prevention efforts. We as men are capable of caring about gender-based violence for the women we know, women and trans folks will never know, and men, including ourselves. When we as men recognize that gender-based violence and its underlying roots of patriarchy are also ruining our lives too, we become more effective, consistent, and sustainable aspiring allies for gender justice.
Hello and welcome to our conversation today. My name is Jonathan Grove. To give you a little bit of context for this conversation, today, it started with a conversation I was having with some friends and former colleagues a couple months ago about a project that we worked on together in 2010. It was a conference called Paving a Rocky Road, Removing Barriers to Men's Engagement. And the purpose of that conference, it's kind of in the title, but we were all working with young men on college campuses trying to do violence prevention and what we would call response, but sort of supporting survivors of sexual and domestic violence and trying to get men involved in that, which was challenging. And so we had this conference to try to make that easier. It was part of a series. And that particular one I partnered with Men Can Stop Rape to do that work. What I had noticed leading up to the conference in my own work on our campus with male athletes, specifically basketball and football and Army ROTC as well, was the challenge that those guys were facing. And what they described to me is they didn't see themselves in sort of our messaging. To that point, most of our work had sort of been, here are the bad things that men do, don't do them. So the conversation was generally about consent and things like that, which are important topics. But what the guys were trying to tell me is we're not bad. And you assuming that we're going to do bad things unless you tell me is kind of just insulting because you're not asking for my help. You're just telling me not to be a bad person that I probably am. And I understood that challenge. And so part of what we were trying to do with that conference was to find language for what is our goal here? What are we asking these guys to do as opposed to not do? We want to really enlist their help and provide a real invitation to a better way of collectively being and not just sort of insult them because that clearly won't work. And what we found, so we had this 2-day conference, great stuff. At the end, there was one big session specifically designed for us just to create some language for what is our goal? What are we striving for? What do we value in men as fathers? You know, what is this goal? What do we want? And we actually struggled. As a result of that, I shifted the way that I was doing the work on our campus. Men Can Stop Rape has continued to have conversations about what they phrase as healthy masculinity, which I should add has started a little bit of controversy, and there's been some conversation, you know, are those contradiction in terms? Is that a possibility? Which is interesting. But the more recent popular culture sort of conversation has really become more about what has been termed toxic masculinity. And I have questions about that. And I hope that that's part of what folks are here to hear about and to talk about as well. And with that, I want to sort of dig into this with our panelists and sort of we've got some interesting ideas here, I think, and wonderful panelists. So Emiliano, I might start with you. I sort of mentioned some of the stereotypical things about masculinity. Um, and just wanted, maybe you can sort of expound on that. What do we mean when we talk about sort of these toxic behaviors?
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. That's a great question. I think, for all of us who are engaged in this work or who just love the boys and men in our lives, I think it's something that we're constantly thinking about, and engaging in conversations around. One of the things that recently wrapped up a book club where we were reading Man Enough by Justin Baldoni. And that phrase, man enough, has sort of stuck with me in terms of it's been sort of, and of course, it's something that I experienced growing up as a boy, and as a man, this idea of manning up, of being man enough, of, sort of like everything that I do is in competition with other boys and men, so I think it's really been something I've been chewing on and thinking a lot about, is how that has impacted my ability to be with men and to engage with men outside of outside of a competition, and it's something that I'm very thoughtful about in terms of my own relationship with my 13-year-old son, and how I've reinforced some of these sort of stereotypes that we associate with traditional masculinity. While I've been, very conscious of that from the jump, I mean, especially as a young man who began to do this work more than 27 years ago, I think really stripping those ideas about masculinity, those sort of traditional toxic ideas of masculinity, stripping those out of my relationships, out of my being, out of the way that I sort of walk and talk and engage with the world. It's just been ongoing, and I don't think in retrospect, my intentions have always been good to be a better man. I always haven't been successful at that, and I think I fall back into those traps of these traditional ideas of masculinity that are harmful and that are painful, not just to myself, but to the folks in my life. And I think that is about, is that sort of accountability is ongoing in terms of taking responsibility for the harm that I've caused, but understanding sort of the root causes of my behavior, these ideas that I have about masculinity. Now, I don't think it's an excuse, but I think all of these things sort of are reinforced on a daily basis. Even being outside, being in the work, I'm still experiencing that sort of like societal pressure that I get from, family and friends and my faith and my coworkers, and, being a father on the soccer field with my son, from the other dads there, from the media, like all the things that I'm consuming online, in terms of the news, and all those are like, all of these ideas are just coming at me. And unfortunately, I think in a lot of ways it's sort of like reinforce these stereotypes about masculinity. So it's just an ongoing battle. It's just like it's like swimming against the tide. And I think, it's exhausting, to be honest. It's like this work, even though I've been engaged in it, like I said, for the last 27 years, I think seeing a shift, right? It's been challenging, seeing the change that's happening among boys and men. It's happening, but not at the rate I would like, but I think it is happening. And so it gives me some hope for the future, and for the future, for my son, because, again, he's become, he's a young man, and he's going to he's going to inherit this world that I've contributed to, that we've all contributed to. And so I think hopefully he has, some of the skills that I didn't have to, again, change his behavior, his language, what I mean? That to me is where I'm most optimistic, is about the future, this particular next generation of young men and men. So to me, that's very exciting. So yeah, I mean, it's very real, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation. And so we need to have more of these conversations. But yeah, it definitely is harmful. It's harmed me, and like I said, it's harmed the people in my life.
Yeah. CJ, you had mentioned to me that that we as a society, I think you put it, we owe it to teenage boys to enable and equip them to be fully human. What did you mean by that? Or do you want to say more about that sort of idea? I think it's a powerful one.
Yeah, I'd love to. Actually, if I could pick up where Emiliano left off and then sort of circle back around to this point about enabling boys and men to be fully human. Emiliano, thank you so much for sharing those personal insights. And I have to say, as someone who just spent the past few years in a high school hanging out with boys for my new book, Boys and Girls, and talking to them a lot about gender, I really saw and documented a lot of what you're seeing about this particular moment that is a really exciting moment because things have changed, right? When I walked down those high school hallways, I didn't hear what I used to hear, which was just like a barrage of homophobic and sexist epithets. I didn't hear it. And it was lovely. And I didn't sort of see it happening all over the place like I used to when I would do research with young men and high school age young men. And I even saw, I sat in a sex ed class that was being taught by a football coach, right? And of course, we all can imagine, like, this is going to go horribly awry. And, it's not ideal to have a football coach teaching a sex ed class if he's not trained in sex education. But that said, he so desired to empower these young folks to have good, healthy relationships with one another that he showed things like the mask you live in, like the empathy gap. So he was showing all of these sort of movies and documentaries about how these more traditional notions of masculinity can be damaging to young men and young women. And then in front of the entire class, he shared how when he was a kid, he used to use homophobic epithets and he thought they were funny and he didn't realize they were mean. And that once he learned they were mean, he stopped. And I remember sitting in the back of that classroom with my eyes sort of welling up thinking, wow, here is an award-winning football coach telling a group of kids sort of off the cuff about his own experience and his own change without shame, without just sort of like, this is what learning looks like, and modeling it, which I think, to speak to some of your concerns, Jonathan, right, thinking about ways that we can empower young men to be more sort of fully human, right? Part of the way we empower them is the sort of modeling that football coach did. Like, hey, I used to do this thing, and then I learned it wasn't great. So I stopped doing that thing. And it's okay to just do that, right? That it was just a sort of really low-key intervention. That said, I've still heard all of these stories from young women about harassment and sexism and assault, right? So clearly all of this is still happening. And I think the problem sort of lies in the fact, and again, you highlighted this, Emiliano, that young men don't fully have a language to engage with sort of feminist thoughts and behaviors. And as you put it, it feels like you're swimming against the tide. And so when I would watch this football coach ask the young men in his class, hey, have any of you had an experience like this? They just had a really hard time talking about it, right? They had a hard time talking about hearing sexist comments, and then they had a hard time talking about what they would do in response to sexist comments. And I think that's because to do so swims against the tide. You risk a lot of your own sort of identity and reputation. So even these young men who internally might want to do that, socially have a hard time doing it because we haven't normalized that language yet. And I think, Jonathan, that's why I would come back to this equipping young men and boys to be fully human, right? That we don't raise them with a language of emotions and empathy. We don't see we don't see children's books, right, that sort of focus wholesale on empathy and relationships among boys. There's some beautiful books out there, But, boys are often adventurers and they're conquerors and they defeat things. And the girls are off sort of having friendships and having these fantasy lives about families. And so I think until we normalize, right, the full range of human emotions for these sort of young boys, that we're going to have a hard time doing this retroactive work at the high school and college level, is my thought. So it's my 2 cents right there.
Michael, would you like to weigh in? It looked like you were maybe making notes earlier, so.
Yeah, look, I mean, I've got lots of thoughts about this. And in a sense, I want to kind of start back a bit. I don't know to what extent your audience is familiar with the kind of terms that we're using. And I suppose I wanted to sort of explicitly comment on the term masculinity itself, because one of the things that happens in Australia and happens in many countries is that when some men hear the term masculinity, they think that what we mean is men, so that any criticism of masculinity is by definition a criticism of all men, including themselves. And obviously some men push back against that. So I want to kind of start with a simple point that by masculinity, we don't mean men, or don't mean men in some simple sense, that the term masculinity, at least as I use it, is a very open-ended term. It refers to the roles, the behaviors, the kind of characteristics or traits that are seen as appropriate for boys and men in a given society. In other words, masculinity is a term for social expectations, for the behaviors or characteristics that are expected of boys and men or seen as appropriate for boys and men. And so the term toxic masculinity marks off one particular version of that. It says there's one particular set of expectations about being a boy, being a man, that are toxic for the boys and men who try to live up to those, and toxic for those around them. And so the term toxic masculinity typically is used to refer to a version of masculinity based on being dominant, being in control, being aggressive, being tough, being kind of rigidly heterosexual, and so on. And how it's toxic is in 2 senses. First, that version of how to be a man is seen as toxic for the boys and men who try to live up to it. That is, that it's limiting for boys and men's own lives, their relationships, their friendships, their physical and emotional health, their parenting of children, and so on. And second, that version of masculinity is seen as toxic for the people around them. The idea is that toxic masculinity, those set of expectations, play into poor behavior, into mistreatment of women and girls and of other men and boys. So the term toxic masculinity is a bit like the term toxic food. It's not saying that all food is toxic and we shouldn't avoid food. It's saying there's some forms, some versions of food that are toxic, that are bad for us. And one thing to mention is the phrase toxic masculinity is a fairly recent one. It was used by Paul Kivel and others in, I think the 1990s to refer to some kind of rigid, narrow expectations of masculinity that shaped men's lives in prison, for example, or shaped men's health. But the term had no kind of currency at all till about 2013, 2014, when it started to be used in media commentary and popular commentary. And now it's very much the term of the day. It's absolutely ubiquitous. But it was really only from about 2015 that it started to be used. It didn't originate in feminist critical commentary on men and masculinities. It originated in kind of work with men and men's health commentary. But it's now kind of widely used as a critical term for some expectations of masculinity. So yeah, I think the term toxic masculinity is an interesting one. And I have mixed feelings about it. I think on the one hand, it's useful, hopefully, in getting across the idea that there's one version of how to be a man, one set of social expectations, which is not very good for us, not very good for men and boys, and not very good for those around us. And it implies that there are other ways of being a man, other versions of masculinity that might be healthy or positive or productive. And I think the phrase helps to popularize a kind of feminist critique of gender and gender inequalities. And it certainly rests on a kind of vast body of scholarship showing that the men who try to conform to those ideals of masculinity, the ideal that you should be tough, you should be in control, you should be stoic, you should repress feminine emotion and so on, The men who try to conform to those ideals of masculinity, they're more likely to be violent towards women and girls. They're more likely to be violent towards other men. They're less likely to be involved in fathering. They're less likely to ask for help when their own health is suffering, and so on. In other words, there's a vast body of evidence that conformity to masculinity, to that version of masculinity, shapes boys' and men's behavior. So, the term toxic masculinity has some use, I think, and it's similar to other terms like the man box, or terms like patriarchal masculinity or traditional masculinity, or to use an academic term, hegemonic masculinity. In other words, a term for a particular set of cultural ideals that shape men's and boys' lives in some limiting ways. But it's also got some risks. And one is, as I've said, that any use of the term masculinity is heard by some men as a reference to all men, and that's not what we're trying to do. Another problem is that it may highlight only the harms to boys and men themselves, the way that trying to live up to those ideals is limiting for boys and men, and not also the harms that that version of masculinity involves against others, against women and girls, against men and boys, against trans people, and so on. So it may highlight only male disadvantage and not also male privilege, dynamics of sexism, of gender inequality, and so on. And a final danger is that it may be used in kind of generalizing and homogenous ways. Certainly some uses of the term toxic masculinity really imply that it's a problem only of men of color or working class men or Indigenous men. So in other words, there's a kind of racist and classist othering that goes along often with commentary on masculinity in general that also can play out in relation to the term. So for myself, I'm sometimes nervous about the term toxic masculinity. I tend to use more feminist terms, more political terms, such as patriarchal masculinity, that name the way that some versions of masculinity are based on dominance. Dominance over women and girls, dominance over other men and boys. But yeah, I'm interested to hear what our others on the panel think about the phrase and the way it's used in helpful or unhelpful ways. CJ, Emiliano, is it something that you would offer in your own media commentary or public commentary?
No, I appreciate it, Michael. I mean, that just like, thank you for defining that for us, right? Just the historical context of sort of the language that we use. I think in my work in terms of as a men's engagement specialist, over the last I've been here at TASA for 15 years, engaged in this work, trying to engage men in these conversations. I've actually have moved away from using toxic masculinity, right? And I appreciate, your use of like masculinities. So you'll hear me refer to masculinities, to your point, that there are a lot of different forms of masculinities, right? So there's a way of showing up and being, and I try not to use that language for the same reason that you've talked about in terms of, boys and men that I've engaged tend to be, very defensive, and again, immediately respond that, hey, I'm not the problem, so I think it just, I try to figure out, what's the most appropriate language, and I'm also very aware in terms of the language, how it has been used in terms of oppression and racism, and so that terminology has, I've been referred that way. Other men of color have been referred that way. Like, I feel like that very much has impacted my sort of use of that language, because it is painful, right? And it is divisive, and it really has been a significant barrier in terms of, for me, professionally and personally, to be able to engage in those conversations. So I think, that's why I appreciate this conversation in terms of really focusing on the positive aspects of masculinities, right? Really kind of getting into what does it look like, right? Like, what are the things that we're engaging in on a daily basis in terms of our relationships with people in our lives that are really positive, that are reinforcing these ideas that we want to see in the world. And so I appreciate that. And I think it is important for us to talk about language, right? For us to have these conversations and to be critical and to be thoughtful about the language we use and how we use it. And so I really appreciate, your commentary on that. So thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you just said about the use of toxic masculinity as a way of reinforcing particular forms of privilege. Parents, when I speak to them about teenage boys and what it means to be a man, often sort of in recent years have asked me about toxic masculinity, and it's a term I don't use in my own talks or research. But it's been interesting to watch families and young men use it, because for them, I think what the term has done is give them a way in, right? It's given them some sort of way in to sort of unpack masculinity in a way that feels less like a direct attack than some other ways of talking about it. So I have my reservations about it, but I've also seen young men using it to sort of try to make sense of these cultural expectations of masculinity in a way that I think is helpful. I think what then happens, though, is what Emiliano has pointed out, which is that it becomes a catch-all phrase for things that are not me, right? It becomes the part of an othering process by which privileged young men often sort of assign toxic masculinity traits to less privileged young men, right? Sort of classed, racialized, or sexualized others, right? They're like, well, I don't engage in toxic masculinity, but that guy does over there, right? He's the violent one, not me. And so it becomes like many of these sort of phrases of the day, a nebulous term by which people can say, well, I'm not toxic, but that guy is. Therefore, I'm a good guy and nothing I can do is bad, right? So it is this term that just occupies this really complicated cultural space, is both helpful and can also be used in ways that might set us back a little bit. So I'm very ambivalent about it, but I think we should use it to the extent that it is useful in helping young men understand that there are other more fully human ways of being in the world.
CJ, can I ask, my sense is that whatever language we use for criticizing the ugly things that some boys and men do, both to other boys and men and to women and girls, that othering process will take place. That it's, I work in the men's anti-violence field, and one of the most comforting and kind of initial places that many men begin with is, it's a problem of other men. It's a problem, and I'm here to rescue. I'm here to kind of save women from those bad men. And of course, one of the first things that we invite men to do is to look at our own lives, to look at our own involvement in, our complicity in these things. But othering is a very common sort of strategy. Is it an issue that, whatever language we use, that will see that kind of othering dynamic too?
I think that is such an interesting question, because of course that's always a possibility, right? We know that inequalities are very tenacious, right? It's hard to change inequality that's been built into our world, into our schools, into our churches, into our romantic relationships. And so I think this is partly what your question speaks to. It's like, well, that inequality is really hard to get rid of. So language will always sort of shift to reflect that inequality, perhaps support it. And so to an extent, I think you're correct. But I think what you're also highlighting is the need for us to not rely on these pithy little terms, right? But to look at actual practices. And what I often do with young men when I speak to them or when they ask me questions is I talk about expectations of our behavior versus using terms like masculinity and femininity. And part of that emerges from my sort of lived experience as a queer woman, that sort of in queer culture, masculinity and femininity are so sort of fun and nebulous and chaotic. And I think it's one of the things I love most about being in a queer community. And so I don't always find those terms super helpful personally. And so what I tend to focus on are cultural expectations, right? Do you get messages like you should do X because you are a guy, right? And I think that helps sort of keep the conversation away from terms like masculinity and femininity, which can both put people on the defensive and, as you've pointed out, be sort of reused in ways that support inequality rather than challenge it. So that's my take on it.
Just to weigh in, a lot of those things resonated for me. What I love about the sort of the describing the goal type ethos, if you will, is that what it also does, purely from I'll put it in sort of prevention terms on a college campus, if we're talking about what we want and these sort of good pro-social behaviors and healthy things, people who don't do those are no longer part of the norm. They sort of stand out from everyone else, ideally, and that's maybe utopian. But I think if we're working toward that, then not only is sort of this negative behavior, it becomes the outlier, as opposed to so normative. It also, it encourages people to continue doing the things that are healthy. And it also, I think, at the same time, offers a kind of, Michael, what you were describing. Like, there are many ways to be a male person, and they're all valid as long as you're doing it in a healthy way that doesn't harm other people. So, like, it's not an either or. It's that, there are multiple avenues here. I think it tends to open that up a little bit when you start talking about, but here are the positive things. And we, recognizing here, like consent and some of those things are very concrete, and you can say, these are important. But it allows for some of that fluidity that you're talking about, CJ. And, everybody's different and everybody's going to do it differently. And creating a way for that to still have value. Because I think that what speaks to me about being fully human, I have 2 boys, and I've tried very hard as a father to not replicate my experience, which was like, here's the one path for you. This is the kind of you that will be valued. Anything that diverges from this impossible, by the way, mold will be punished severely. And I think the more that we can sort of open that up, the better off we're all going to be. That's more than 2 cents, but that's me jumping in there. Other thoughts on that topic?
Can I jump in with a great example of what you just said about the sort of shifting of a norm?
Yeah, please.
And that people who hold more sort of outdated or more harmful views might be then sort of outliers. I got to watch this happen in real time, in a way that I feel like is a testament to much of the feminist work many of you have been doing. So it's part of why I want to share this, and for people who might be watching this to not get discouraged about change, because change is happening. When I was at this high school doing my research, I sat in on training about how to prevent sexual violence, right? And so I'm in an auditorium with hundreds of students. It's darkened. There's lots of text-heavy slides at the front. It's the kind of thing that most of the time students just sort of check out and they don't care. They're on their phones, right? But I watched as they weren't on their phones, and they were actually quiet and listening. And at one point, the facilitator of this event starts giving this room full of hundreds of teenagers some scenarios about how to do bystander intervention, right? So the facilitator gives the scene at a party, and it's a scene where you might have some questions about whether everybody's consenting, and then asks for responses from these teenagers about how they might intervene in that situation. And to my shock and delight, student after student volunteered ideas about how to intervene in that situation, and then the rest of them cheered, right? And so it was this incredible moment of, and some of the answers were from boys and some were from girls, right? So it was this incredible moment of watching something that so many folks have worked hard for, which is to normalize consent and to normalize bystander intervention. And I watched it happen in real time in a way that I think really speaks to the possibilities of change around issues of sort of masculinity, sexuality, and consent. So I put that up there.
Others?
That sounds very inspiring, CJ.
Michael, I wanted to sort of steer back toward, take what we've talked about and steer it toward fathering a bit. Not just because I'm a dad, but in the context of fathering together. But I think, as we think about how do you shift norms and how do these things perpetuate and all of that sort of thing, so much of that is sort of embedded in those kinds of relationships, whether it's, directly father to son or a father-like figure or a coach. All of those things are sort of implicated. So I'd love to hear some more about your thoughts on maybe that sort of piece of it.
Look, happily, I wanted to comment though before that on, we've focused a lot on the kind of negatives, if you like, of kind of toxic masculinity. And I just wanted to revisit that to say briefly that the kind of alternative that we now see promoted in the engaging men field, whether it's promoting men's involvement in fathering or men's anti-violence work and so on, is often the notions of kind of healthy or positive masculinities. And I wanted to comment briefly on that. And I think that in terms of challenging the kind of dominant and patriarchal norms that shape men's and boys, and thus women's and girls and other people's lives, there's three things we have to do. We have to kind of highlight the harms of those versions of masculinity. We have to kind of weaken their cultural grip, challenge their sources, turn up the volume on diversity among boys and men and so on. And third, we have to promote some kind of healthy or ethical alternative. And the kind of simple idea there is that boys and men cannot be what they cannot see. So we have to we have to kind of provide visible, positive alternatives to some of the kind of negative and patriarchal models of how to be a man that are so evident in our culture. And there's a whole debate around what that actually looks like. What does healthy or ethical or positive masculinity look like, and what do we call it, and so on. But to move to your question, I think that part of what healthy or ethical masculinity looks like is nurturance, care, nurturance, compassion, those kind of traditionally feminine qualities that are often disregarded or seen only as the kind of province of women, or seen as, in fact, something that men, literally incapable of showing. So I think part of a kind of positive alternative is a sense of men as involved in healthy and positive ways in care, caring for children, pulling the weight domestically, and so on. And if we go back to the research on masculinity, one of the things it finds is that men who conform more strongly to those traditional, or if we want to say toxic, forms of masculinity are less likely to be involved in fathering, because they're more likely to believe that men aren't capable of care, or it's not men's roles to care, or it's women's work, and so on. So part of what limits men's involvements in fathering and parenting work is precisely those kind of traditional norms of masculinity, as well as, family unfriendly workplace cultures, systemic wage inequalities that mean that heterosexual couples often pragmatically choose that she will take time off work, she will stay home, and he'll continue at work because his wage, like many men's wages, are higher than hers, and so on. So I think part of our kind of vision of alternative has to be a sense of a positive vision of fathering. And one of the things we're up against here is some traditional models of how to be a father that are disengaged, that are authoritarian, that are even downright kind of violent and dominating. And so part of our work, I think, is constructing and promoting alternative, positive visions of men's care, of positive involvements in caring and fathering work. I'm not sure if that's answering the question you asked, but anyway, I hope that's relevant.
Absolutely. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that, Michael. I mean, Jonathan, you brought in Men Can Stop Rape. They have this thing called the counter story, right? So I am the counter story, right? So I think to this point about living sort of this sort of new sort of masculinities, right? Like that's how I live my life, right? That's how I conduct myself at work, and that's how I conduct myself with my partner, and that's how I conduct myself with my son and my coworkers, my classmates, etc. Right? Like I want to, I'm trying every day to walk the talk in terms of sort of living this new vision of masculinities. And I think to me, that's really transformative work, because it is the counter story to everything that I experienced, that I witnessed at the hands of other men, specifically the men who were father figures in my life. It's the complete opposite, right? So folks kind of, to what you were saying earlier about that range of fathers, I experienced the very harmful forms of fatherhood, with experienced a tremendous amount of trauma at the hand of men who are father figures. And I think that's like, I want to be at the other end of that in terms of being fully present, fully authentic, being fully engaged, nurturing, caring for all the things that I didn't experience as a boy. I want to be that for my son. And I think it is a privilege. I mean, it honestly is a privilege, and I was not quite prepared, and I still don't think I'm prepared. So I'm learning every day. He's teaching me a lot about what it means to be a father. And so, but that also has come with, just an amazing partner, and being able to parent together this amazing boy, and seeing him become this young man. He starts high school in the fall, and that just blows my mind, right? Like, his lived experience is so different from mine, and that the cycle of violence has ended in just one generation. Like, his ability to have sort of a different experience of a father, and the relationship that we have is really profound to me, because it's nothing I've ever experienced, right? And I get to experience that every day with my son. And I think, all the things that you were talking about is like the things that I've been engaged in since before he was born. All the things, like all the lessons that I've learned have really been transformative and prepared me for this particular role. And I think it's the most important role that I have, next to being a partner. And so I think, again, those lessons have been invaluable, but I think what has been important is to have a community of fathers, right, who support me, encourage me, hold me accountable, and who are modeling the things that that I want to see in myself, and really help me sort of continue to be better. And I think that is a huge blessing, to be able to have this community of fathers fathering together, provides that community. And I've very fortunate to have a lot of amazing fathers in my life, like Jonathan, who really are examples, like that. They're just living their life, they're doing their thing, they're raising their kids, they're doing the work. And I think that, like, is how I want to live my life. And I think that's been really transformative. I don't have to say anything. I just be myself, and I just go out and live in the world, and do my work, and people see that. And I think that's an important model that I didn't have. So I want to be that model that just didn't exist in my neighborhood. It didn't exist in my home. It didn't exist in my community. I want to be that model for other men, especially men of color, and I think that's sort of like that particular role, I think, has been not just transformative for me, but I think for other men as well. And so, like I said, it's work. I have to put in the work. It hasn't been easy, but I think, to your point, I think, it's something that I definitely just want to promote, and just, through the way that I live, and my actions, and I only imagine, if my son decides to be a father, what kind of dad he's going to be. I mean, he's just like 100 times better than me, and so I really believe that. And I think that, to me, is, just exciting. Again, that hope that I have for the future, and really believing that is, that's men's work too, and so I appreciate you, Michael, just rooting us in that, because I think it's so important, and it spoke so much to me. Thank you.
And I'm thinking, so I obviously don't have fathering experience. I am a woman. I identify as a queer woman. But I had this brief moment that really makes me think back to, Michael, your comment about looking at the source of where these messages are coming from. So when we had our first kid, I didn't carry. I carried the second two. My wife carried our first child. But what that meant was I was reading all the baby books to try to figure out what I was supposed to do. Right, here I was, this non-gestational parent. What was my job? And what it meant was I was reading the messages for fathers, right? Because, God forbid, somebody write a queer parenting book. They weren't around at that time. And so I started reading these baby books, and I read book after book. And they treat, to the extent that fathers are even acknowledged, they're treated like bumbling fools and clowns. And I just kept thinking, how can we create a world where men can be fully human when we just disregard their importance in family life and all the gifts that they bring, both sort of in terms of service, in terms of energy, in terms of all the ways that people father? They're nowhere in these books. And so there is a place in this world for someone to write a beautiful parenting book that is about all the parents that might be involved in a child's life, including the father, right? Because right now, that I think is this very sort of, it's a subtle but a deeply painful piece of fathering that I see out there.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, CJ. I would encourage folks that are watching to read an excellent book by a friend and colleague of mine called Equal Partners by Kate Mangino. And it's a phenomenal book. I mean, it really speaks to what you're talking about in terms of, I was very fortunate to be profiled in the book along with other men who, to your point, Michael, are really engaged in the work of nurturing, caring for, raising their children with their partners. And I think it was really invaluable to be able to see myself and other men's experiences. Like I wasn't the only one, you know what I mean? Because to your point, yeah, that's exactly how I felt. And it was very challenging before, Joaquin came along to find content that really spoke to me, that really encouraged me, that really rooted me in sort of my role and responsibility as a partner and as a parent. And this particular book was, I think those stories have been really powerful, to be able to know that I'm not alone, and that it's not just the equal partnerships in terms of being able to take care and raise your children, but also to be an equal partner in terms of with your partner and share, the responsibilities of everything, in terms of washing dishes and cleaning and all the things that we like that were sort of like stripped, or that was the work of women, to your point, Mike, earlier. It really has been transformative in saying that's my work too, right? Like we share these responsibilities. And I think that's been really invaluable. And I want my son to see that. I want him to know that we as men have an important role and a responsibility to be fully engaged as partners and as parents I think it really has, again, given him the tools that he needs to go into relationships and to have sort of a set of expectations for what those relationships look like, based just on the model of me and my partner, Cynthia, who's just an amazing woman and just an amazing mother. And again, those lessons that he's taking from both of us, I think will really, inform his ability to be just a great dad. And like I said, greater than me. So I appreciate you saying that, CJ.
Just to add on to what you're saying there, Emiliano, you were talking a lot about responsibilities, and just on a very real personal level, I'm a stay-at-home dad, have been for 10-ish years, longer than that. Um, but part of my investment in this, my dad is a wonderful person, but particularly when I was younger, we didn't have a depth of relationship. We would talk about stuff a lot, very sort of working class, rural dynamics. Um, and I didn't want that with my boys. I wanted closeness. I wanted real emotional connection. Um, and so there's a degree to which it's purely selfish and it's just what I wanted. Um, I think it's working out for everybody. Um, but it is about responsibilities. It's about loading the dishwasher. It's about all those like very tactile day-to-day kinds of things. But um, it's not all responsibility. There's a whole lot of joy there. And I think oftentimes we forget when we're talking about men and masculinity, we forget about joy, and don't leave that on the table. Just
Yeah.
give them a hug, soak it up.
Thank you for saying that, Jonathan, reminding us that, right? That's a very much, yeah, the word love, and being able to just be able to hug and kiss and to like,
Best.
be with my kid and to watch him do just amazing things. He's graduating from 8th grade this month. It's just like it is a gift and it is a privilege. And I think it has been also, it has opened my heart, right? Just like to your point, it really has opened my heart. And I think in ways that were just like just completely unexpected. There are just moments that I'm just like, what is happening, right? So it has been very transformative. It is really, yeah. I mean, it has taken me to places, and I'm sure the fathers who are watching this can it resonates with them as well. It really takes you to places that you just weren't expected, like you weren't expecting or you weren't prepared for. And I think that's why that community of fathers, right, to be able to hear those stories is so critical, so important, so that we don't feel alone, we don't feel isolated, and we know that there's this whole community of fathers who are with us, right, in the same boat, and who are putting in the work, and I think that's an important example, not just for our families and our children, but I think for the world. To your point, Michael, it's like, how do we live these messages, right? How are we in the world? And I think that we just don't know. To your point, CJ, that the implications of the work that we've been doing over the last 4 decades in terms of really doing these types of education in the schools with boys and girls, right? That they are now embracing those concepts. And to your point earlier, Michael, about normalizing these conversations in society, I think is really invaluable. So we don't really know what the future holds, but I'm confident that it will be a world without violence, right? Where there will be, we just won't even need to have this conversation, because that just will be the way it is. Like, just things are going to be so great. There will be no need to have these types of panels and to have these kinds of conversations. I believe that. And if it's not in my lifetime, I hope it's in my son's lifetime. So I think that's the hope that I have for the future.
Can I leap in there? Just in terms of father's involvement, father's positive involvement, what's really clear from our own stories, and I'm a father too, but from our stories and from the research, is that positive father involvement is good for partners, good for children, and good for fathers themselves. In fact, good for men's own kind of emotional engagement in the world and our own emotional capacities. But I did say positive father involvement, and one of the things that's happened in Australia is that there's been a kind of an uncritical emphasis on the need for all children to have contact with their fathers, which has meant that in family law, for example, there's been the idea that a violent father is better than no father at all. And large numbers of children have been placed in contact with fathers who are abusive towards them and to the mothers of those children. And that's just starting to be wound back in Australia, where there's a growing recognition that violence by fathers, I mean, of course, there's violence by mothers and others, but that violence by fathers is damaging for children, damaging for mothers, and that in a sense kind of disqualifies you from, being an effective and appropriate father. So I think I wanted to bring the kind of healthy masculinities conversation and the fathering conversation together to say that, that there's good and bad. And obviously our visions of fathering have to be about non-violent and equitable fathering as well. But just to end on a more positive note, fathers have a vital role to play in shifting these models of masculinity that we've been talking about. I literally last week published a piece of research with colleagues that showed that one of the most important influences on young men's version of masculinity and the kind of forms of masculinity that young men adopt is the forms of masculinity adopted by their fathers. In other words, there's a kind of powerful influence of intergenerational transmission, where fathers of models of how to be a man are kind of transmitted in broad ways down to sons. And we've known that for a long time, but this was one of the first pieces of research to actually document that statistically. So I'd say that fathers have an absolutely vital and positive role to play for all kinds of reasons. And one of them is that we can help contribute towards more equitable, more democratic visions of gender and gender relations.
Well, Michael, I was going to ask about, we have 2 sociologists. I was going to ask about sort of big picture structural things, since we had talked about sort of personal. CJ, did you want to add anything, either structural or not?
I think I would add sort of 2 things to build on this discussion of fathering, and something Michael said earlier, which is that, of course, fathering is embedded in policy, right? Because all policy is about our values, right? And right now we have policy in the US that still supports a fairly anemic role for fathers in children's lives, right? And so I think doing things like guaranteeing equal pay for equal work, guaranteeing parental leave, right? Guaranteeing paid parental leave, guaranteeing family leave and paid family leave to care for family, right? All of those sorts of things are ways we can, of course, put our ethics to work, right? But I think the other thing that is a little bit interesting here is that I think a lot about how what equitable family systems look like, what equitable family systems look like, both in terms of labor and what they look like in terms of love. And I can't help but think here about scholar Jane Ward's work, right, from a sociological perspective. So Jane Ward wrote this beautiful book called The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, which is really a misnomer. Because really what the book is about is looking at lesbian family life and suggesting ways for straight men to become more fully human. In her words, how to help straight men really love women, right? And by really loving women, what she means is addressing all the things we've talked about here, right? Finding joy, being an empathetic and nurturing father and partner, doing the things like emptying the dishwasher. And she suggests that what's great about lesbian relationships, right, is that gender inequality gets sort of removed from the equation. We can talk a little bit more about how that works. But that they have these very equitable home lives because of that, for the most part, right, the research suggests. And so that if we want a model for sort of happy, healthy masculinity, right, that is the place we can look. And so I think it speaks to where we're sort of ending here, which is where are places, where can we look for positive changes? Where can we look for positive role models? And so one of these places, as you've highlighted, are fathers and shifts in these fathering practices. And according to Jane Ward, another place we might look is lesbian families, which is perhaps ironic, but an interesting twist. So I'll end my comments there.
Michael, it looked like you might be thinking something that I don't know if you want to share or just thinking.
No, look, I love that point. Look, I think there's so much that, straight men like me have to learn from women, including from lesbian women. So I appreciate that plug for Jane Ward's work. And yeah, very much endorse that sense that we have to rethink not only the kind of systems and policies that are in place, but also the kind of much more intimate questions, as CJ said, of love, of connection, and so on.
One last sort of question for the group. Fathering Together is certainly a resource. We've heard several others through the course of our conversations, but any favorite resource that you would encourage, somebody who's maybe watched this and it's got their brain going and they just want to, read a book, dig in a little deeper. I'll give you a second to think, because my absolute favorite book is the late Bell Hooks, The Will to Change: Men, Masculinity, and Love. It's part of a whole series on love, but it is, for me, it was one of the most profoundly beautiful ways to, sort of like you might with your brother, hold him accountable. Hey, you're doing stupid bad things, but I love you and you're capable of so much more. It's absolutely my favorite and always my recommendation. So I'll lead off with that.
I love that, Jonathan. I endorse that. It's a phenomenal book. It is really transformative, especially if you're sort of new to the work or new to Bell Hooks's work. Yeah, it's an important book to read. I love Voicemail Magazine. It's an amazing national quarterly publication. It's been around for a very long time, really exploring and digging deep into these conversations that we're having today around fatherhood, men's health, mental health, men's sexuality, et cetera, right? So in terms of the research, the work that's happening, not just around here in the country and territories, but around the world. And I think it's an important publication that every male-identified person should subscribe to and read and share. I think it's an important, just in terms of being informed and just really engaging in sort of a very, when we think of these traditional masculinity magazines, the complete opposite, right? So it's really the counter story to like Men's Health or Playboy or any of the other Maxim or any of the other men's magazines that I consumed, that I subscribed to growing up. And so I think it's an important publication, and definitely encourage everyone to read it. I think it speaks to everyone, especially to folks who are non-binary, who are women and girls. I think it's an important publication for all of us, but I definitely want to encourage folks to get a subscription to Voicemail and share it with the boys and men in their lives.
I've got two in mind. One is Rebecca Asher's book, Man Up, Boys, Men, and Breaking the Male Rules. And the other is Liz Plank's book, For the Love of Men, From Toxic to a More Mindful Masculinity.
And since I focus on kids, my suggestion will be a book that fathers can read with their kiddos, which is a book called Boy, Oh Boy by Cliff Leak, that has a range of profiles, a range of men doing good things in the world as men. And I think it sets out a wonderful example of male role models that can help us forge a new path for ways to be men.
Thank you again for joining us today. The goal of the Father's Friday Summer Series is to provide stories and strategies to empower dads to be emotionally courageous, connected, and committed. I hope you get as much out of this conversation as I did.